Virgin Mountain Man won 8 Amish mail-order brides, but he had shocking plans. The church bell tolls in a snow-dusted frontier town. A crowd gathers as a rugged mountain man steps off the stagecoach, 8 trembling Amish brides at his side. Whispers ripple. He won them all, but what's he going to do with them? Everyone expects scandal, but instead of claiming them as wives, the loner stuns the crowd with a vow no one saw coming. He'll protect them, without taking a single bride. The town gasps. The railroad men smirk. The preacher pounds the pulpit, demanding marriage or exile. And just when peace seems possible, a forged deed threatens to steal his land, and sickness strikes inside his cabin. By lamplight, hymns rise against the storm. By daylight, enemies close in, ready to brand him a liar, a sinner, a thief. He was once mocked as the Virgin Mountain Man. Now, his shocking plan will either save 8 innocent women or destroy them all. Will the frontier break him, or will he prove that true manhood is measured not by possession, but by mercy? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The late September sun had already dipped behind the Rockies when Charles Boone rode into Denver, his pack horses laden with beaver pelts and elk hides. Dust coated his worn boots and threadbare coat as he made his way down the bustling main street, the clip-clop of hooves mixing with the everyday sounds of the growing town. He'd timed his arrival just right. Tomorrow was trading day at Henderson's General Store, when the fur prices would be highest before winter set in. Charles patted the neck of his sturdy bay horse, Promise, as they passed the newly built Methodist church. A crowd had gathered around its wooden steps, and something made him rein in for a closer look. A colorful broadside caught his eye, its fresh ink still gleaming in the fading light. "Mail-order brides from Pennsylvania," it proclaimed in bold letters. "Support our church. Enter the raffle. $1 per ticket. Drawing tonight." Charles shifted in his saddle, weathered hands gripping the reins a little tighter. He wasn't one for gambling, but something about the word church made him pause. His father's stern voice echoed in his memory. "The Lord's house must be tended, son. That's our duty as Christian men." The church's roof clearly needed repair. He could see missing shingles from where he sat. Before he could think better of it, Charles dismounted and approached the ticket table, fishing a silver dollar from his pocket. "Much obliged," he said quietly to the ticket master, accepting the small paper slip numbered 47. He tucked it into his shirt pocket, already planning to stable his horses and find a corner of hay to sleep in. It would be a kind thing, he reckoned, to support the church's needs before heading back to his cabin tomorrow. But Providence, it seemed, had other plans. The meeting hall was packed that evening, full of rough-hewn miners and cowboys jostling for space on the wooden benches. Charles stood at the back, his tall frame allowing him to see over most heads to where Reverend Thompson stood on a small platform, hands raised for quiet. "Brothers and sisters," the Reverend began, "we're grateful for your generous support of our church repairs. Now for the moment you've all been waiting for, the drawing of our grand prize." Charles barely paid attention as the ticket master approached with a wooden barrel full of paper slips. His mind was on tomorrow's trading and the long ride home ahead. He didn't even notice when the first number was called. 4. The crowd leaned forward. 7. Charles blinked, suddenly aware of heads turning his direction. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his ticket. The numbers matched. "Do we have 47?" the Reverend called. "Step forward, sir or madam." Charles felt his face flush as he made his way through the parting crowd. Their eyes followed him, some curious, others amused. He climbed onto the platform, ducking his head to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. "Well now," Reverend Thompson said warmly, "we have our winner. Mr. Question Mark. Boone," Charles managed. "Charles Boone. Mr. Boone. And now for our grand prize." The Reverend gestured to a side door which opened to reveal 8 women in plain dark dresses and white caps. They entered in a tight group, the younger ones clustered behind the eldest, their faces pale with anxiety. Charles felt the blood drain from his face. I don't understand. 8 fine Amish sisters from Pennsylvania, the Reverend announced proudly, come west seeking Christian husbands. Their passage was paid by our congregation, and now, a whoop went up from the crowd, followed by scattered laughter. Someone in the back called out, "Looks like Mountain Man's got himself a whole harem." Charles's face burned hotter. The sisters drew closer together, the eldest, who couldn't have been more than 30, lifting her chin defiantly despite her obvious fear. Now, Reverend Thompson said, trying to quiet the growing merriment. Mr. Boone has won the responsibility of escorting these good women to safe homes. We trust him, as a Christian gentleman. More laughter drowned out his words. Charles stood rooted to the spot, his mind spinning. He looked at the sisters, at their trembling hands and wide eyes, and something inside him hardened with resolve. His father had taught him that a man's measure was in how he treated those weaker than himself. "I'll see them safe," he said, his quiet voice somehow carrying over the noise. The hall gradually fell silent. The eldest sister stepped forward slightly. "I am Rebecca Stoltz," she said in careful English. "These are my sisters. We thank you for your protection." But her eyes were wary, and her sisters pressed closer to her skirts. Charles nodded, unable to find more words. The Reverend beamed and began to close the proceedings, but Charles barely heard him. His mind was already racing ahead to practical matters: lodging, supplies, the long journey ahead. The crowd began to disperse, some still chuckling and nudging each other. Charles descended from the platform and approached the sisters, keeping a respectful distance. "There's a good inn just down the street," he said softly. "I'll pay for your rooms tonight. Tomorrow we can figure things out." Rebecca translated his words into what Charles assumed was German, and her sisters whispered among themselves. Finally, she nodded. "We are grateful, Mr. Boone." The walk to the inn was mercifully short, though Charles felt every stare that followed their unusual procession. He arranged for 2 rooms, the best the innkeeper had, and paid extra for hot water to be brought up. The sisters filed upstairs, Rebecca pausing only long enough to wish him a quiet good night. Charles headed for the stable, where he'd already arranged to sleep near his horses. He spread his bedroll in an empty stall, but sleep was far from his mind. The stars winked through gaps in the roof as he lay there, trying to make sense of the evening's events. 8 sisters, 8 souls he was now responsible for, at least until they found proper homes. The mountain winter was coming on fast. He could smell it in the air. His cabin was remote, barely big enough for one. And what would people think? Him taking 8 women up there? He rolled onto his side, the hay crackling beneath him. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "I reckon you've got your reasons, but I sure wish you'd let me in on what they are." The horses shuffled in their stalls, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Charles pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges he'd never imagined facing. But, as sleep finally began to creep over him, one thought remained clear. He'd given his word to protect those sisters, and he meant to keep it. Wind whistled through the stable's gaps, carrying with it the first hint of snow from the mountains. Charles drifted off to the familiar sounds of town settling down for the night, unaware that his simple act of charity had just changed not only his life, but the lives of 8 frightened women who were now depending on him to see them through whatever lay ahead. The night deepened, and Denver's streets grew quiet. In their rooms above the inn, the sisters whispered prayers in their native tongue, while in the stable below, a solitary mountain man dreamed of snow-covered peaks and the long trail home, a trail that now seemed more daunting than ever before. The morning sun cast long shadows across Denver's muddy streets as Charles waited outside the inn. He'd risen before dawn to secure 9 tickets on the Breckenridge stage, his mind churning with practical concerns. The sisters emerged precisely at 7 o'clock, dressed in identical plain black dresses with white caps covering their hair. Ruth, the eldest, led them in an orderly line like ducklings following their mother. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," Ruth said softly, her English careful but clear. Her blue eyes met his briefly before lowering modestly. "We are ready for travel." Charles nodded, throat tight with awkwardness. "Stage leaves in 20 minutes. Best we head that way now." They walked in silence through the awakening town, Charles carrying their few bags while the sisters clustered together. Their unusual procession drew curious stares from miners heading to breakfast and railroadmen starting their day's work. Charles heard whispers and scattered laughter following them, but he kept his eyes fixed ahead, shoulders square. At the stage depot, he helped each sister board, careful to keep his touch light and proper on their elbows as they climbed up. Ruth sat nearest the door, with Esther beside her. The others arranged themselves on the facing bench, their skirts rustling as they settled. Charles took his place last, perching somewhat uncomfortably on the driver's side. The stage lurched forward with a crack of the whip. Inside, the silence stretched thick as morning fog. Charles stared at his boots, aware of the sisters' sideways glances, but unsure how to begin conversation. Finally, Ruth spoke. "We are grateful for your kindness, Mr. Boone, but perhaps you could tell us your intentions?" Her voice wavered slightly on the last word. Charles cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I aim to see you all safe, that's all. Never meant to win that raffle, truth be told. But now that Providence has put us together, I'll do right by you and your sisters." "You are not seeking," Ruth paused, choosing her words carefully. "Marriage?" "No, ma'am," Charles said firmly, finally meeting her eyes. "I'm not the marrying kind. Just want to help you find proper homes is all." Some tension seemed to leave Ruth's shoulders. She translated his words into German for her sisters, and Charles caught the relief in their quiet murmurs. The stage rattled on, climbing into the foothills. Outside the windows, pine trees grew thicker, and the air took on the sharp scent of coming snow. Young Leah pressed her face to the glass, eyes wide at the mountain views. Sarah hummed softly, a hymn that seemed to calm her sister's nerves. Around midday, fat snowflakes began drifting past the windows. The temperature dropped steadily as they gained elevation. Charles noticed Esther shivering despite her warm shawl, her face pale and drawn. "Relay station's coming up," he said. "We'll stop for hot food." The station was a rough log building with smoke curling from its stone chimney. Inside, the station keeper's wife had a pot of venison stew bubbling over the fire. Charles paid for 9 bowls, then stepped back. "Ladies first," he insisted, gesturing to the steaming pot. The sisters exchanged glances, unused to such deference from a man. One by one, they filled their bowls, murmuring quiet thanks. Charles waited until all 8 had taken their share before serving himself, choosing to eat standing by the door while they clustered around the rough wooden table. Hannah, the practical one, spoke quietly to Ruth in German. Ruth nodded and turned to Charles. "My sister wishes to know if you have experience with mountain winters, Mr. Boone." "Been living up here 15 years, he replied. "Got a cabin near Fairplay, know how to keep warm and fed when the snow flies." More German conversation followed. Charles caught Lydia studying him with frank curiosity, noting how he handled his rifle and gear with practiced ease. Miriam whispered something that made Sarah giggle, earning a stern look from Ruth. The snow was falling harder when they resumed their journey. The stage moved more slowly now, wheels crunching through fresh powder. Naomi dozed against Miriam's shoulder while Leah continued her wide-eyed watching of the passing landscape. By nightfall, they reached the way station where they would spend the night. It was a 2-room cabin with a separate bunkhouse for travelers. The station keeper's wife, Mrs. Peterson, took one look at the unusual group and began fussing. "Land's sakes, 8 proper ladies can't sleep in that drafty bunkhouse. They'll take my back room, all cozy with the quilts. You men folk can have the bunks." But Charles shook his head. "Much obliged, ma'am, but I'll bed down by the fire. Sisters can have the room to themselves." Mrs. Peterson clucked her tongue but didn't argue. She served them a simple supper of beans and cornbread, then showed the sisters to their quarters. Charles spread his blanket near the hearth, his saddle for a pillow. Through the thin wall he could hear the sisters' soft voices as they prepared for bed. His German was poor, but he caught his name mentioned several times, followed by worried tones that gradually shifted to something more contemplative. "Erst seltsam," he heard one say. "Miriam," he thought. "Strange." "Aber gut," came Ruth's quiet reply. "But good." The fire crackled low as the sisters' whispers faded into sleep. Charles lay awake, watching shadows dance on the ceiling. He was strange, he supposed, a mountain man playing guardian to 8 Amish women. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. "Son, the Lord puts folks in our path for a reason. Your job's just to help them along their way." Outside, the snow continued falling, blanketing the world in white silence. Charles finally drifted off, lulled by the steady breathing of 8 souls now under his protection, and the soft popping of pine logs in the fire. Dawn came gray and cold through frosted windows. Charles woke to find Ruth already up, helping Mrs. Peterson prepare breakfast. Their eyes met across the room, and Ruth gave him a small nod. Not quite a smile, but something close to trust beginning to form. The other sisters emerged one by one, their hair neat under fresh white caps. They moved with more ease now, less frightened than the day before. Even shy Naomi managed a quiet, "Good morning," as she passed Charles's bedroll. While they ate, Charles heard them discussing him in their native tongue. Though he couldn't understand the words, the tone had changed from yesterday's fear to cautious acceptance. They'd seen him sleep on the floor rather than claim the bunkhouse beds. They'd watched him wait to eat until they were served. Small gestures, perhaps, but they painted a picture of a man unlike those who had jeered at the raffle. None of them yet knew what lay ahead. Not Charles, not Ruth, not the youngest sister Leah, who still stared at the mountains with mixture of wonder and apprehension. But as they prepared to board the stage for another day's journey, something had shifted. The sisters no longer huddled quite so closely together, and Charles found he could meet their eyes more easily. They had taken his measure during that long day and night of travel, and found him, if not entirely comprehensible, at least worthy of their guarded trust. It was a small beginning, but perhaps enough to build upon, as the stage carried them deeper into the Colorado wilderness, toward whatever future Providence had in mind. The stagecoach rattled into Breckenridge as afternoon shadows stretched across the muddy street. Fresh snow draped the steep-roofed buildings like sugar frosting, and chimney smoke rose straight in the still, cold air. Charles peered through the window, noting the unusually large crowd gathered at the depot. Word of their unusual party had clearly traveled faster than the stage. The coach lurched to a stop. Through the frosted glass, Charles could make out at least 30 townsfolk bundled against the cold, their faces eager with curiosity. He recognized Marshal Tom Dillard's tall figure near the depot steps, and Reverend Phillips in his black coat, both men wearing concerned expressions. "Ladies," Charles said softly, "there's quite a welcome party out there. Best let me step down first." Ruth nodded, her face composed but her hands tight in her lap. The other sisters huddled closer together, their plain black dresses stark against the coach's worn leather seats. Charles opened the door and descended, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. He turned and offered his hand to Ruth, helping her down with careful respect. One by one, the sisters followed, each stepping carefully onto the narrow metal step before taking Charles's steadying hand. "Well, if it ain't the lucky winner," a rough voice called out. Charles recognized Jake Murphy, the saloon owner's brother, swaying slightly near the depot wall. 8 brides for one man? That's what I call a proper raffle prize. Nervous titters rippled through the crowd. Charles felt his face grow hot, but kept his attention on helping Leah, the last sister, safely to the ground. The 8 women drew together, their white caps and plain dresses making them look like a flock of doves amid the colorful frontier clothing of the onlookers. Marshal Dillard stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "Charles," he said quietly, "might want to have a word with you about this situation." Before Charles could respond, Jake Murphy pushed his way forward, whiskey fumes preceding him. "Ain't right. One man claiming 8 wives. We got laws against such things, even out here in the territories." "Now see here," Charles began, but Murphy wasn't finished. "Mormons got run out of Illinois for less," the drunk declared. "Ain't Christian, ain't proper, ain't—" "That's enough." Charles's voice cut through the growing murmurs. He hadn't shouted, but something in his tone made even Murphy fall silent. Charles stepped forward, conscious of every eye upon him, the suspicious townsfolk, the concerned marshal, the sisters watching with barely concealed fear. "I need to make something clear," he said, his soft voice carrying in the sudden quiet. He lifted his hand, as if taking an oath. I did not win wives. I won neighbors, and I mean to protect them until they find their place." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Charles continued, his face flushed but his voice steady. "These ladies came west, seeking honest marriages and good homes. They were raffled off like cattle, which ain't right. But since Providence put them in my care, I aim to see them settled proper and safe." Reverend Phillips stepped forward, his thin face creased with concern. "But surely, Mr. Boone, you can't mean to keep 8 unmarried women under your roof, the impropriety dash." "There's nothing improper about neighbors helping neighbors," Charles cut in firmly. "My cabin's big enough for them to winter safe while we find them suitable situations. Any man wanting to court one of these ladies can do so proper and respectful, with their consent and their sister's blessing." The sisters exchanged startled looks. Ruth's eyes widened slightly. Clearly, this was the first she'd heard of Charles's plan. Marshal Dillard stroked his mustache thoughtfully, while Murphy gaped like a landed fish. "Well now," the marshal said slowly, "that's quite a declaration, Charles. You're taking on quite a responsibility." "Yes, sir, I am." Charles met the lawman's gaze steadily. "And I'd appreciate any help this town might offer in finding good situations for these ladies come spring." A new murmuring rose from the crowd, but different now, thoughtful rather than accusatory. Charles caught fragments of conversation. "Got that empty Muller place. Thompson's boy looking to marry. Need a schoolmistress something fierce, huh?" "This is highly irregular," Reverend Phillips protested, but with less certainty now. "These women need proper homes, proper husbands." "And they'll have them," Charles said firmly, "in good time with proper courtship and their free choice. Meanwhile, they need shelter and respect, not gossip and scandal." He turned to the sisters who stood watching this exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to cautious hope. "Ladies, if you'll allow me, I'll see your trunks to the hotel. Marshal, might I have a word after they're settled?" The crowd began to disperse, though Charles could hear the buzz of conversation that would soon spread through every house and shop in Breckenridge. Jake Murphy stumbled away, muttering to himself. The marshal nodded slowly. "I'll be in my office," he said. "Don't tarry too long." Charles supervised the unloading of the sisters' trunks, carrying the heaviest himself, despite the hotel porter's offer of help. The sisters followed him into the hotel's warm lobby, where the proprietor's wife, Mrs. Henderson, rushed forward. "Oh, you poor dears, you must be frozen. Come, I've got hot tea ready, and your rooms are all warm." She shooed them toward the stairs, then turned to Charles with a knowing look. "I've put them in the East Wing, Mr. Boone. Far from the regular guests, nice and private. And don't you worry. I'll make sure no one bothers them." "Much obliged, Mrs. Henderson." Charles set down the last trunk. "Ladies, you'll be safe here. I need to speak with the marshal, but I'll return before supper to make sure you have everything you need." Ruth stepped forward. "Mr. Boone," she said softly, "what you said out there, did you mean it?" Charles met her steady gaze. "Every word, ma'am. You have my word. No one will force any choices on you or your sisters while you're under my protection." Something shifted in Ruth's face, not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. She nodded once, then followed Mrs. Henderson up the stairs, her sisters trailing behind like a line of black-clad ducklings. The hotel's wide porch was empty in the gathering dusk. Charles sank into one of the wooden rocking chairs, suddenly bone-weary. The enormity of what he'd just promised settled over him like a heavy blanket. 8 women, all his responsibility. 8 lives depending on his protection and judgment. The last light faded from the snow-covered peaks, leaving the street lit only by lamplight from windows and the occasional glow of a cigar as someone hurried past. Charles could hear the clink of glasses from the saloon down the street, the slam of a distant door, the crunch of boots in snow. Normal evening sounds in a frontier town, but somehow everything felt different now. He closed his eyes, letting his head rest against the chair's wooden back. "Lord," he whispered, "I sure could use some guidance here. These women need help, but I'm just one man, and not much of one at that. Show me the way to do right by them." No divine answer came on the evening breeze, but as Charles sat there, he felt his resolve strengthen. He might not be wise or wealthy or even particularly sociable, but he could offer safety and respect to 8 women who'd been treated like trading goods. Maybe that was guidance enough for now. The marshal would be waiting, and there would be hard questions to answer. The town would buzz with gossip for weeks to come. Come spring, there would be suitors to evaluate and decisions to make. But for this moment, Charles sat quietly in the gathering dark, watching his breath make clouds in the cold air, and knew with certainty that he'd made the only choice his conscience would allow. The morning sun cast long shadows across Breckenridge's frost-covered streets as Charles made his way to the hotel dining room. Inside, the 8 sisters already sat at a long table, their black dresses and white caps stark against the flowered wallpaper. Mrs. Henderson hovered nearby, pouring coffee and fussing over them like a mother hen. Charles had just settled into his chair when the dining room door swung open. 3 men in expensive suits strode in, their polished boots clicking on the wooden floor. The tallest man, his silver watch chain glinting, approached their table with a practiced smile. "Mr. Boone," he extended a manicured hand. "James Wheeler, Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. These are my associates, Mr. Parker and Mr. Mills. Might we have a word?" Charles rose slowly, conscious of the sisters watching. "Morning, gentlemen. I'm in the middle of breakfast with my neighbors." "Oh, this won't take but a moment," Wheeler gestured toward an empty table in the corner. "Business proposition, you understand." Reluctantly, Charles followed them. Wheeler pulled out a chair, his smile never wavering. "We've heard you have quite a spread up in the mountains, Mr. Boone. Prime location, really. The railroad's always looking to expand its interests." "My land ain't for sale," Charles said flatly. Parker leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Now, Mr. Boone, let's be reasonable. Your situation has changed. 8 unmarried women under your roof? People talk, reputations suffer. Might be wise to consider a fresh start somewhere else." Charles felt heat rise in his neck. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Parker?" "Threatening?" Wheeler's laugh was smooth as creek ice. "Not at all. We're offering you an opportunity. The railroad pays fair prices. Better to sell now than wait until scandal forces your hand." Charles stood, his chair scraping back. "My land ain't for sale," he repeated, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "And neither is my good name. Good day, gentlemen." He returned to the sisters' table where 8 pairs of eyes watched him with varying degrees of concern. Ruth's hands were clasped tight in her lap, her coffee untouched. "We should get moving," Charles said, keeping his voice steady. "Long day ahead." The supply store sat at the end of Main Street, its wooden porch stacked with barrels and crates. Inside, the shelves reached to the ceiling, packed with everything from rope to rifle cartridges. Mr. Wilson, the storekeeper, hurried forward at the sight of such unusual customers. "Mr. Boone, ladies, what can I do for you today?" Charles pulled a list from his pocket. "Need winter supplies, flour first, 8 50-pound sacks." Mr. Wilson's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't comment. Instead, he began gathering their order. Flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, kerosene, matches, soap, and 8 thick wool blankets. When Charles asked about a stove, Wilson led them to a small cast-iron model in the corner. "Just got this in last week, bit smaller than most, but it'll heat up nice and even. Good for cooking, too." Charles examined it carefully. "We'll take it. Need stovepipe, too." As Wilson tallied the bill, Charles noticed the sisters examining everything with quiet interest. Naomi, the youngest, ran her fingers over a bolt of calico fabric, while Hannah studied the row of preserved fruits. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, watching through the windows. When it came time to load the wagon, Charles refused all offers of help. He carried each heavy flour sack himself, placing them carefully in the borrowed freight wagon. The sisters tried to help with lighter items, but Charles insisted they save their strength for the journey ahead. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a basket of fresh bread and cold chicken. "For your journey," she said, pressing it into Ruth's hands. "God bless you all." The morning was well advanced when they finally set out. Charles drove the wagon while the sisters huddled in the back, surrounded by supplies. The borrowed team moved slowly, their breath steaming in the cold air as they climbed into the mountains. The road wound higher, following Clear Creek's twisting course. Aspen leaves fluttered gold against the blue sky, while pine trees marched up the steep slopes. Charles kept one eye on the sky, watching for weather, and one on the sisters. They seemed to be holding up well, though the jolting wagon couldn't be comfortable. Around mid-afternoon, Sarah spotted a herd of elk crossing a meadow above them. The sisters watched in wonder as the animals moved like shadows through the golden grass. Charles smiled at their excitement. It was good to see them taking pleasure in something after all their trials. The sun was setting when Charles finally called a halt beside a clear creek. He chose the spot carefully. Good water, sheltered from the wind, with plenty of dead wood for fuel. While he unhitched the horses, the sisters climbed stiffly from the wagon. "We should get a fire going," Ruth said, looking around with practical eyes. "There's still light enough to cook." Charles nodded. "Plenty of dry wood in those fallen trees. But stay close. There's wolves in these hills." The sisters worked together with quiet efficiency. Soon they had a cheerful fire burning, with the new pot bubbling full of bean soup. Charles paced the perimeter of their camp, rifle ready, while the women worked. Occasionally he caught fragments of their soft conversation or a brief laugh quickly stifled. As darkness settled over the mountains, the sisters gathered close to the fire. They had spread their new blankets on pine boughs, making rough but serviceable beds. The soup's savory smell filled the air, mixing with wood smoke and the sharp scent of pine. Charles kept his distance, staying alert for any threat, but he couldn't help noticing how the sisters had arranged themselves, the older ones on the outside, protecting the younger, with little Naomi in the center. They had their own way of watching out for each other, just as he watched out for all of them. A wolf howled in the distance, its cry echoing off the canyon walls. The sisters huddled closer together, but none showed panic. Charles saw Ruth whisper something to Hannah, who nodded and passed a reassuring touch to Sarah's shoulder. "Mr. Boone?" Ruth's voice carried clearly in the quiet night. "There's plenty of soup if you'd care to eat." Charles hesitated, then moved closer to the fire. "Much obliged," he said softly, accepting the tin cup she offered. The soup was simple but hot and filling, made better by Mrs. Henderson's bread. As they ate, Miriam spoke up hesitantly. "Those men in town, they wanted your land?" Charles nodded. "Railroads always pushing up into the mountains, they thought they could pressure me into selling cheap." "Because of us," Esther said quietly. "They thought having us there would cause trouble." "Don't you worry about that," Charles said firmly. "My land's my own and you're welcome on it as long as you need." He paused, then added, "It's not much, just a cabin and some outbuildings. But it's solid, and there's room for all." The sisters exchanged glances in the firelight. Something passed between them, some silent communication born of years living as one family. Finally, Ruth spoke for them all. "We're grateful, Mr. Boone. We don't know what lies ahead, but we thank you for your protection." Charles ducked his head, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Best get some rest," he said gruffly. "Still a long way to go tomorrow." The sisters settled down, pulling their blankets close against the mountain cold. Charles added wood to the fire, then resumed his watchful pacing. The night was alive with small sounds, the creek's endless murmur, the soft shifting of the horses, the occasional cry of a distant owl. Looking back at the sleeping women, Charles felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. The railroad men's threats still echoed in his mind, but he pushed them aside. He had given his word to protect these women, and he meant to keep it, no matter what storms might lie ahead. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up to join the stars. Charles kept his vigil through the long night, watching over his unexpected charges as they slept beneath the vast mountain sky. The wagon creaked slowly up the narrow mountain trail, its wheels crunching through patches of early snow. Charles guided the tired horses carefully around sharp bends, while behind him, the sisters huddled deeper into their blankets against the biting wind. 2 days of hard travel had left them all weary, but Charles knew they were close now. The path wound through thick stands of pine and aspen, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. Around mid-afternoon, they crested a final ridge, and Charles pulled the team to a halt. "There it is," he said quietly, pointing ahead, "home." The sisters leaned forward to look. Below them, nestled in a protected valley, sat a sturdy log cabin beside a frozen stream. Thin wisps of smoke rose from the stone chimney, dancing in the cold mountain air. A small barn and several outbuildings stood nearby, their rough-hewn logs weathered silver by sun and snow. "Someone's there?" Miriam asked, noticing the smoke. Charles nodded. "My neighbor, Jim Miller, asked him to check on things while I was gone. He'll have kept the fire going." Ruth studied the cabin with practical eyes. Though simple, it showed signs of careful construction. Straight walls, a solid roof, windows with real glass. The clearing around it had been well maintained, with neat stacks of firewood and a small vegetable garden, now frost-killed and waiting for spring. The horses picked their way down the slope, their breath steaming in the cold air. As they drew closer, Charles could see Jim's horse tied near the barn. The old prospector appeared in the cabin doorway, waving a greeting. "Brought it back warm for you, Charles," he called out, then stopped short at the sight of the 8 women in the wagon. His eyes widened, but he recovered quickly, touching the brim of his hat. "Ladies." Charles jumped down to help the sisters from the wagon. They moved stiffly after the long journey, but gathered their skirts and climbed down with quiet dignity. Jim watched in amazement as Charles guided each one safely to the ground, treating them with careful respect. "Jim," Charles said, "these are the Yoder sisters. They'll be staying here a while." His tone made it clear he didn't want questions. Jim nodded slowly. "Well then, I'd best be getting on. Left you some fresh bread and coffee on the table?" He mounted his horse, still looking bewildered. "Weather's turning bad. Storm coming in from the north. Take care, all of you." As Jim rode away, Charles led the sisters toward the cabin. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but it's warm and dry." Inside, the cabin was spare but meticulously clean. A fire burned low in the stone fireplace, and late afternoon light filtered through the windows. The main room held a rough-hewn table with benches, a few chairs, and shelves lined with provisions. A door in the back wall led to a smaller bedroom. The sisters looked around, taking in their new sanctuary. After weeks of travel and uncertainty, the solid walls and warm hearth felt like a blessing. Hannah noticed the neat stack of firewood beside the hearth, while Lydia examined the well-swept wooden floor. "You keep a tidy home, Mr. Boone," Ruth said softly. Charles ducked his head. "My father taught me. Said cleanliness shows respect for God's gifts." He moved to add wood to the fire. "We should bring in the supplies before dark." The sisters insisted on helping unload the wagon, though Charles wouldn't let them carry anything too heavy. Soon the provisions were stored away, flour and beans in the root cellar, the new stove assembled in its corner, blankets and other necessities stacked neatly on shelves. As dusk approached, Sarah and Esther began preparing a simple meal from Jim's bread and their remaining travel provisions. The familiar routine of cooking seemed to settle them all. Charles stepped outside to tend the horses and gather more firewood, giving the women space to arrange themselves. When he returned, the cabin had already begun to transform. The sisters had spread their shawls over the chairs, set the table with his tin plates, and hung their bonnets on pegs by the door. The new stove radiated warmth, and the smell of cooking filled the air. "Mr. Boone," Ruth called, "would you join us? The cornbread is ready." Charles washed his hands at the basin, then sat awkwardly at his own table. The sisters arranged themselves on the benches, and Ruth served thick slices of golden cornbread with the last of their journey's butter. For a moment, no one spoke. The simple act of sharing a meal in peace seemed blessing enough. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. "It's strange," she said softly. "We've traveled so far, met so many people. But this is the first time." "The first time what?" Charles asked when she trailed off. "The first time a man has treated us as honored guests," Lydia finished for her sister. "Not as property to be won or burdens to be borne." Charles flushed and stared at his plate. "You deserve better than what happened in Denver. I aim to see you get it." After the meal, the sisters insisted on cleaning up while Charles brought in one last load of firewood. Snow had begun falling steadily, thick flakes swirling in the gathering darkness. The temperature was dropping fast. When he returned, Ruth met him by the door. "Mr. Boone, we can't take your bed. It wouldn't be right." "You'll have to," Charles said firmly. "All of you can fit in there better than out here. I've got my blankets. I'll be fine by the fire." "But please," Charles cut her off. "My father would rise from his grave if I let women sleep on the floor while I took the bed." Ruth studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you for everything." Charles shook his head. "I'm not fit for thanks, just doing what's right." The sisters prepared for bed, taking turns washing at the basin and changing behind a blanket hung for privacy. Charles laid out his bedroll near the hearth, adding extra wood to keep the fire through the night. As the cabin settled into darkness lit only by the fire's glow, a soft sound rose from the bedroom. The sisters were singing, their voices joining in perfect harmony on an old Amish hymn. The German words were foreign to Charles, but the melody spoke of peace and protection. He lay back on his blankets listening. The familiar loneliness of his cabin, which had always seemed natural before, suddenly felt different. The sisters' song filled the rough-hewn walls with something new, the sound of family, of shared faith, of human warmth. Charles felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the solitude he'd built around himself. He turned toward the fire, blinking hard against unexpected moisture in his eyes. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping the cabin in a soft white blanket, while inside, the hymn drifted to a gentle close. The night deepened. The fire crackled softly. For the first time in years, Charles Boone's home held more than silence. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Charles woke first, as always, and quietly stoked the dying embers in the fireplace. The cabin's main room was cold, his breath visible in the dim light. He added fresh logs, careful not to wake the sisters sleeping in the bedroom. The door creaked softly as he stepped outside to begin his morning tasks. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, coating everything in pristine white. His boots crunched through the new powder as he made his way to the barn to feed the horses and check on the livestock. By the time he returned, smoke was rising steadily from the chimney, and he could hear movement inside the cabin. The sisters were early risers too, trained by years of farm life. Through the window, he saw them already at work, some sweeping the floor, others organizing their few belongings. Ruth met him at the door, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. "We thought you might need this after being out in the cold." "Much obliged," Charles said softly, accepting the cup. The warmth seeped into his cold fingers. "I need to chop more wood before the next storm." "We'll help where we can," Ruth replied. "Your home needs a woman's touch." Charles nodded, oddly touched by their desire to contribute. He watched as the sisters fell into an efficient rhythm, Esther and Miriam preparing breakfast, Hannah and Sarah sorting through their meager supplies, Lydia and Naomi helping the younger ones organize the sleeping area. The morning passed in steady work. Charles hauled logs from the woodpile to his chopping block, the steady thunk of his axe echoing through the crisp air. Inside, the sisters transformed his bachelor cabin with small touches. Fresh swept floors, neatly arranged shelves, laundry hanging from makeshift lines strung between the rafters. Near midday, Charles paused in his work, leaning on his axe handle. The sight of clean shirts and linens fluttering in the mountain breeze stirred something in him. A memory of his mother, perhaps, from before she passed. He'd been too young to remember her clearly, but sometimes these glimpses came to him, like shadows of what home could mean. Ruth approached him, breaking his reverie. "Mr. Boone, the others are worried about being so far from town, about protection." She hesitated. "We've never lived this deep in the wilderness." Charles straightened. "You should all know how to handle a rifle, just in case." He retrieved his spare Winchester from the cabin and spent the next hour showing them its basic operation. Most of the sisters hung back, but Ruth paid close attention as he demonstrated how to load, aim, and fire safely. "Like this?" Ruth asked, raising the rifle to her shoulder. Her form was awkward, but determined. "A bit higher," Charles said, carefully adjusting her grip. "Now squeeze the trigger gentle-like, don't pull." The rifle cracked and a tin can flew off the fence post. Ruth's eyes widened in surprise, while her sisters clapped from the porch. "Good shot," Charles said, impressed. "You're a natural." Ruth handed the rifle back, her cheeks pink from more than just the cold. "I pray we never need to use it, but thank you for teaching us." As afternoon settled in, the sisters insisted on showing Charles some of their own skills. They gathered in the cabin's warm kitchen, where Esther demonstrated their traditional way of making biscuits. Charles watched, fascinated by the sure movements of her hands as she worked the dough. "You try now," Esther said, offering him a handful of flour. Charles's large hands were clumsy with the delicate task. The sisters tried to hide their smiles as he struggled, flour dusting his beard. Even the younger ones grew bold enough to offer advice. "Not so hard, Mr. Boone," Sarah suggested. "You're not chopping wood now." When the biscuits came out of the oven, some were perfect and others charred black as coal. Charles stared at his misshapen attempts, embarrassment crossing his face. But then Lydia giggled, and suddenly they were all laughing. Even Charles, his deep chuckle joining their lighter voices. "Well," he said, holding up one particularly burned specimen, "reckon these might make good doorstops." The sound of his laughter seemed to surprise them all. Ruth looked at him with new understanding. This quiet mountain man had depths they were only beginning to discover. He wasn't their captor or their master, but something altogether different, a protector who asked nothing in return. As they cleaned up from their baking lesson, the sisters taught Charles one of their hymns. His deep voice was uncertain at first, but he caught on quickly to the simple melody. The German words were strange in his mouth, but the sisters' clear voices carried him along. The peaceful moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Charles moved to the window, his posture tensing as he spotted a rider coming fast up the trail. It was Marcus Weber, a rancher from the valley. His horse was lathered despite the cold, suggesting he'd ridden hard to reach them. Charles stepped out to meet him, conscious of the sisters watching from inside. "Charles," Marcus called, reining in. "Thought you ought to know there's trouble brewing in town." "What kind of trouble?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Preacher Jameson gave quite a sermon yesterday. Called you out by name. Said you're living in sin up here, hoarding wives like some kind of mountain sultan." He spat in the snow. "Said any God-fearing man should be ashamed to let it continue." Charles's jaw tightened. Behind him, he heard the cabin door open and knew the sisters were listening. "That ain't how it is," he said quietly. "I know that," Marcus replied. "Known you too long to believe such nonsense. But others ain't so sure. There's talk of forming a committee, coming up here to investigate the situation." He paused. "Some of them ain't planning to be gentle about it." Charles nodded slowly. "Much obliged for the warning, Marcus." "Watch yourself," the rancher said, wheeling his horse around. "And those women, too. Way some folks are talking." He left the thought unfinished as he rode away. Charles turned to find all 8 sisters gathered on the porch, their faces pale with worry. Ruth stepped forward. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," Charles said firmly. "This is your home now, long as you want it. Ain't no preacher or committee going to change that. But if they come, then we'll face them together," Charles said. His voice was quiet, but carried an iron certainty that made the sisters exchange glances. They saw in his stance and his steady gaze that this shy, awkward man would stand against the whole world to keep his word. "Now," he continued, trying to ease their fears, "let's see about supper. Those biscuits won't burn themselves." The attempt at humor worked. The tension broke as the sisters smiled, remembering their earlier laughter. They filed back inside, where the cabin's warmth and the simple tasks of cooking helped push away thoughts of outside threats. But that evening, as they gathered around the table, a new awareness hung in the air. The sanctuary they'd begun to build here was fragile, threatened by those who couldn't understand their unusual family. Charles saw the worry in their eyes, heard it in their quieter voices. Yet as they shared their meal, he felt more certain than ever. He'd made a vow to protect these women, and he meant to keep it. Let the town talk. Let the preacher thunder. Here in this cabin, they were building something true and good. A community bound not by marriage or blood, but by choice and trust and growing affection. Charles looked around the table at these 8 brave women who'd traveled so far and endured so much. They weren't his wives or his possessions. They were his neighbors, his friends, perhaps even becoming his family. And he would defend them, no matter what tomorrow might bring. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the mountain night deepened. Inside the cabin, 8 sisters and 1 quiet mountain man finished their supper together, finding strength in their unity, preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain path as Charles guided his wagon toward Breckenridge, with Ruth and Esther beside him on the wooden seat. The sisters sat straight-backed in their plain black dresses, while Charles hunched forward, his broad shoulders tense beneath his buckskin coat. They needed supplies, nails for repairs, lamp oil for the darker evenings ahead, but he dreaded taking them into town. "You didn't have to come with me," Charles said softly, glancing at Ruth. "We won't hide forever," Ruth replied, her voice steady. "Besides, Esther has letters to post to our family in Pennsylvania." Esther nodded, clutching the carefully written pages in her lap. Her face was pale from the early morning chill, but determination showed in her eyes. The wagon rattled down the mountain trail, hooves and wheels crunching through patches of early snow. Charles noticed how Ruth steadied her sister whenever the path grew rough. The bond between them was plain to see, making his protective instinct stronger. As they approached Breckenridge, the first whispers began. Townspeople stopped their morning tasks to stare. A group of women outside the mercantile drew their shawls tight and turned away. Two miners elbowed each other, grinning beneath dirt-streaked faces. "Looky there," one called out. "Mountain Man's brought his harem to town." Charles's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward. Ruth placed a gentle hand on his arm, sensing his anger. "Their words can't harm us," she murmured. They hadn't gone 10 paces further when Marshal Tom Dillard stepped into the street, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. His weathered face was creased with concern. "Charles," the marshal called. "Need a word?" Charles pulled the wagon to a stop. "Marshal." Dillard glanced at the sisters, touching his hat brim. "Ladies?" He turned back to Charles. "Walk with me a minute?" Charles hesitated, looking at Ruth and Esther. "We'll be fine," Ruth assured him. "The store is just there." Reluctantly, Charles climbed down and followed Dillard to the shade of a nearby building. The marshal's spurs clinked softly as he walked. "This situation of yours," Dillard began, "it's causing talk, bad talk. Ain't my concern what folks say?" "Should be." Dillard's voice was low, urgent. "Town's getting riled up. Preacher's been visiting influential families, stirring the pot. Simple way to quiet it all down. Just marry one of them sisters. The others could stay on as family, proper, like." Charles's face reddened. "That what you came to say?" "I'm trying to help, Charles. You're a good man, but appearances matter out here. People won't understand what you're doing, keeping 8 unmarried women up there." "I made a vow to protect them," Charles said, "not to own them." "Sometimes the right thing ain't the simple thing," Dillard sighed. "Just think on it." Before Charles could respond, Ruth's voice rang out clear and strong behind them. She had followed, leaving Esther with the wagon. "Mr. Boone has been nothing but decent," she declared. "More decent than those who'd force marriage where there is no love, just to quiet wagging tongues." A small crowd began gathering, drawn by her words. Among them were several railroad men, their clean suits standing out among the miners' rough clothes. They watched with calculating eyes, whispering and smirking. Dillard spread his hands. "Ma'am, I meant no offense, just trying to find a peaceful way through this mess." "Peace built on falsehood is no peace at all," Ruth said firmly. "We stay with Mr. Boone because we choose to, not because any law or ceremony binds us." Her words caused a stir among the onlookers. Charles saw the railroad men draw aside, speaking in low voices and casting glances their way. Something in their manner made his skin prickle with warning. "We should get our supplies," he said quietly to Ruth. "Daylight's burning." Inside the store, Charles tried to focus on their needed items while Ruth and Esther selected lamp oil, but he couldn't help overhearing the railroad men who had followed them in, speaking none too quietly near the back counter. "Preacher's a God-fearing man," one said, "but even the most righteous have debts. Might be persuaded to call for those women's removal if it meant his church mortgage getting paid off." "Shame if something happened to that mountain cabin," another added. "Awful dangerous living so far out. Accidents happen." Charles's hand tightened on the sack of nails until his knuckles went white. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think of his father's teachings about controlling anger. But the threat to his home, to the sisters under his protection, made his blood run hot. Moving quickly, he gathered Ruth and Esther. "We need to go now." They must have heard something in his voice, for they asked no questions. Charles paid hastily for their supplies and helped them into the wagon. As he climbed up himself, he saw the railroad men watching from the store window, their smiles sharp as knife blades. The ride back was tense and quiet at first. The wagon creaked beneath them as they climbed into the mountains, leaving the town's suspicious glares behind. The sisters sat close together, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. "What did you hear in the store?" Charles hesitated, then told them about the railroad men's plot with the preacher. No point hiding danger from those who needed to face it. "They aim to force us out," he finished, "one way or another." Esther's face had gone even paler, but Ruth's eyes flashed with anger. "They think they can use God's own minister as a weapon against us?" "Money's a powerful tempter," Charles said grimly, "even for holy men." They rode on a while longer before Ruth spoke again, her voice softer now. "I've never known a man like you, Mr. Boone. Most would have taken the marshal's advice, claimed one of us as wife to save face, or sold your land to the railroad and left us to fend for ourselves." Charles felt his face grow warm. He stared straight ahead at the trail, unable to meet her gaze. "Wouldn't be right," he mumbled. "No," Ruth agreed. "It wouldn't. But many men care more for what's easy than what's right." The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of gold and rose. The other sisters came out to help unload supplies, but they grew quiet when they saw the serious faces of the returning party. Inside, gathered around the warm hearth, Ruth and Esther shared what they had learned in town. The younger sisters huddled closer together as they heard about the railroad's schemes and the preacher's potential betrayal. "What will we do?" Naomi asked, her voice trembling. "We'll do what we've been doing," Ruth answered firmly. "Live honest lives, work hard, and trust in God's protection through Mr. Boone's kindness." Charles stood apart from them near the window where he could watch the darkening forest. The sisters' soft voices behind him spoke of fear, but also of determination. They had found something precious here: safety, respect, the beginnings of true friendship. None of them wanted to lose it. He thought of the railroad men's threats, of the marshal's well-meaning but misguided advice, of the preacher who might be bought with silver like Judas. The easy path would be to give in, to marry Ruth or one of her sisters, to bow to the town's demands. But as he listened to the women talking, sharing their fears and their courage, Charles knew he could never take that path. These sisters had trusted him to be their protector, not their master. He would honor that trust, whatever storms might come. The mountain night deepened around the cabin. Inside, 8 sisters and one quiet mountain man faced the knowledge that their peace was threatened. But they faced it together, finding strength in their unusual family, preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. The mountain winter settled deep around Charles Boone's cabin, wrapping it in thick blankets of pristine snow. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves, catching the pale sunlight. Inside, warmth and life flourished where once there had been only solitude. Sarah stood at the wooden table, her sleeves rolled up and flour dusting her apron as she kneaded bread dough with practiced hands. The yeasty smell filled the cabin, mixing with wood smoke from the stove. Her soft humming matched the rhythm of her work. "That smells wonderful," Charles said quietly as he came in from checking the horses. Snow melted from his boots by the door. Sarah smiled, pleased. "It's Mama's recipe. She always said bread needs loving hands to rise proper." At the window, Miriam sat in the best light, her needle flashing as she worked on hanging curtains she'd fashioned from spare calico. The fabric was simple, but she'd added careful embroidery along the edges, delicate patterns of leaves and vines that brought a touch of grace to the rough-hewn walls. "These will keep the draft out better," she explained, catching Charles's glance, "and maybe add a bit of cheer." He nodded, touched by how they'd transformed his sparse bachelor cabin into something approaching a real home. Hannah sat at the table with the younger sisters, pointing to letters she'd scratched on a slate. "Now remember," she was saying patiently, "the th makes a different sound than just T. Try it again." The sisters bent their heads together, whispering the sounds. Charles marveled at how naturally Hannah had taken to teaching. She'd told him once that education was precious to their people, even if kept simple. A knock at the door made them all look up. Charles opened it to find Lydia stamping her feet on the porch. "The barn roof needs attention," she reported. "I spotted some loose boards that won't hold through the next storm." Charles pulled on his coat. "I'll see to it." "I'll help," Lydia said firmly. She was already wearing men's work pants under her skirt, something that had scandalized her sisters at first but proved practical for ranch work. Together, they trudged through knee-deep snow to the barn. Inside, Lydia held the ladder steady while Charles climbed up to examine the roof beams. She handed him tools with quiet efficiency, anticipating his needs like she'd been doing this work all her life. "You're good at this," Charles commented as they worked. Lydia shrugged. Pa always said willing hands were more important than whether they belonged to a son or daughter. Besides, she added with a small smile, someone has to help you keep this place from falling apart. The short winter day was fading by the time they finished. As they walked back to the cabin, Charles noticed how the windows glowed with lamplight, warm and inviting against the gathering dusk. Inside, the sisters were preparing supper, moving around each other in the familiar dance they'd developed over the weeks. Sunday dawned clear and cold. After breakfast, they gathered in the main room as had become their custom. Ruth opened their worn Bible, but before she could begin reading, Sarah started singing softly in German, an old Amish hymn their mother had taught them. One by one, the other sisters joined in, their voices rising in beautiful harmony. Charles listened, moved by the pure faith in their song. When they began Amazing Grace in English, he found himself joining in, his deep baritone hesitant at first, then stronger. Miriam caught his eye and smiled encouragingly. The hymn filled the cabin, 8 female voices and 1 male blending together like family. "This truly has become our refuge," Ruth said when the song ended. "God has blessed us here, despite what others might think." The words had barely left her mouth when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Charles went to the door, hand instinctively moving toward his rifle, before he recognized the rider as young Tom Webster from town. "Message for you, Mr. Boone," Tom said, holding out a sealed envelope. "From the town council." Charles broke the seal and read the short message, his expression darkening. The sisters watched anxiously as he folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "What is it?" Hannah asked. "Town council's called a meeting," Charles said grimly. "They aim to vote on whether you ladies can stay here. Some are calling it an indecent living arrangement." "But we've done nothing wrong," Sarah protested. "Don't matter to some folks," Charles replied, "and they've already decided what they want to believe." "When is the meeting?" Ruth asked quietly. 3 days' time." Charles moved to the fireplace and took down his axe. "I mean to be there." The sisters watched as he settled on a stool and began methodically sharpening the blade, the steady scrape of whetstone against steel filling the silence. "Mr. Boone," Ruth said carefully, "you aren't planning to—" He looked up, understanding her concern. "No, ma'am. Just keeping my hands busy while I pray for the right words. Reckon I'll need them more than weapons." Miriam brought him a cup of coffee, her hand brushing his shoulder in silent support. Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes swirling in the dying light. The sisters moved around the cabin, lighting candles in the windows, beacons of warmth against the gathering dark. Sarah's fresh bread cooled on the table, filling the air with its homey scent. Hannah gathered the younger ones for evening prayers. Lydia checked that the barn was secure for the night. Each went about their tasks with quiet determination, as if defying anyone to call their peaceful household indecent. Charles watched them, these 8 women who had transformed his solitary cabin into a true home. They had brought song where there had been silence, warmth where there had been emptiness, faith where there had been doubt. How could anyone call that wrong? The candles flickered in the windows, their light reflecting off the falling snow. Inside the cabin, the sisters' soft voices rose in evening prayer while Charles ran his thumb along the axe's newly sharpened edge. He set it aside and bowed his head, joining their prayers. Whatever came, they would face it together, their unlikely family bound by something stronger than blood or law, trust freely given and honored true. The town hall stood packed to the rafters, with every bench filled and people standing 3 deep along the walls. Coal oil lamps cast flickering shadows across worried faces as Charles Boone made his way down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The sisters followed behind him, their plain black dresses and white caps drawing whispers from the crowd. Reverend Whitaker stood at the front, his face stern beneath gray whiskers. Behind him sat the town council members at a long table, their expressions guarded. To one side, Charles spotted several railroad men, including Theodore Jenkins, the land agent who had tried to pressure him to sell. They wore expensive suits and superior smirks. "Please be seated," Mayor Thompson called, tapping his gavel. "This special meeting of the Breckenridge Town Council is now in session." Charles remained standing as the sisters settled onto a front bench. Ruth caught his eye and gave a small nod of encouragement. The room fell silent, except for the crackle of the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Reverend Whitaker stepped forward, Bible clutched in his hands. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice ringing with rehearsed authority, "we are gathered to address a grave matter of public morality. For months now, we have witnessed the scandalous spectacle of 8 unmarried women living under the roof of a single man, with no proper chaperone or legal bond between them." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Charles kept his eyes forward, though his jaw tightened. "This arrangement flies in the face of all decent Christian society," the preacher continued. "It invites sin and speculation. It sets a dangerous example for our young people. As shepherd of this flock, I cannot remain silent while such impropriety continues unchecked." He turned to face Charles directly. "Mr. Boone, you must either choose one of these women as your lawful wife and find proper homes for the others, or they must leave this community. There can be no middle ground in matters of moral truth." Charles took a deep breath and stepped forward. He had rehearsed his words carefully, praying for wisdom. "With respect, Reverend," he said, his quiet voice carrying in the hushed room, "these sisters are free women of legal age. They came west seeking new lives after losing their menfolk in the war. When that raffle went wrong, I offered them shelter because it was right, not to claim ownership of them." He straightened to his full height, meeting the preacher's gaze. "They are under my protection, not my possession. They work my land and share my home as neighbors, not as chattel. If that offends some folks' sense of propriety, then perhaps it's their hearts that need examining, not our conduct." Gasps and mutters filled the hall. Jenkins, the railroad man, stood up with a practiced look of concern. "This is exactly the kind of rough frontier attitude that drives away decent settlers," he declared. "How can we attract proper families if we allow such irregular arrangements? I move that the council order these women to leave within the week. My company would be happy to arrange transport back east." Before the mayor could respond, Martha Peterson rose from her seat. The rancher's wife was known for her no-nonsense manner and skilled nursing. "If I may speak," she said firmly, "these Amish ladies have been a blessing to this community, though some seem blind to it. When influenza struck the mining camp last month, they helped me tend the sick day and night. Sarah and Ruth know healing herbs better than any doctor. They asked nothing in return." Another woman stood, Emma Wilson, who ran the general store. "And Hannah has been teaching letters to my youngest, along with other children too far from the schoolhouse. My Tommy couldn't read a word before. Now he reads Bible verses at supper." More voices joined in. Mrs. Baker described how Miriam had helped deliver her baby when the midwife was snowbound. The blacksmith's wife praised Lydia's skill with injured horses. Even the marshal's stern-faced mother spoke up about the sisters' generous help with the church quilting circle. Charles watched in amazement as one after another, the town's women defended his unlikely household. The sisters sat with tears in their eyes, holding hands tightly. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "This is unexpected testimony. Reverend, do you have any response?" The preacher shifted uncomfortably. "Good works cannot excuse improper living arrangements. The appearance of sin dash." "Oh, stuff and nonsense," Martha Peterson interrupted. "I've watched that cabin these months past. Mr. Boone sleeps in the barn when weather permits, by the hearth when it doesn't. He treats those girls with more respect than half the married men in this town show their wives." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Charles felt his face grow hot, but he kept his stance steady, watching the council members exchange thoughtful looks. The mayor conferred quietly with his fellows, then rapped his gavel. "Given the evident benefit these women bring to our community, and Mr. Boone's proven character, I propose we grant them provisional permission to remain, subject to review in 6 months' time. All in favor?" Hands rose around the table. Jenkins and his railroad men scowled, but they were ignored. The vote passed 7-2. "However," the mayor added, fixing Charles with a stern look, "we expect continued proper conduct. Any hint of scandal will result in immediate revocation. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Charles replied solemnly. "You have my word." The sisters rose, their faces shining with relief and gratitude. As people began filing out, several women came forward to embrace them, making plans for future visits and shared work. Charles found himself accepting handshakes and backslaps from men who had previously shunned him. The ride home was quiet but peaceful, with the sisters occasionally breaking into soft hymns of thanksgiving. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as they reached the cabin, where Sarah had left a pot of stew simmering before they left. Inside, warmth and familiar smells welcomed them. While the younger sisters set the table, Ruth touched Charles's arm. "We are grateful," she said simply. "Not just for today, but for everything since that strange night in Denver. Perhaps this truly was God's plan, though none of us could see it then." Charles ducked his head, embarrassed by praise as always. But when Sarah called them to supper, he found himself smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes and softened his whole face. They gathered around the table, no longer awkward with each other. Naomi said grace in German, then Leah translated it to English for Charles. The stew was rich with vegetables from their root cellar, and Sarah's fresh bread filled the air with its homey scent. After the dishes were cleared, Hannah brought out her lap harper, a treasured possession from Pennsylvania. As she played, the sisters began to sing, old hymns of praise and gratitude. Charles surprised himself by joining in, his deep voice harmonizing naturally with theirs. Through the windows, stars blazed in the crystal-clear mountain sky, brighter than any city dweller could imagine. The peaks stood like dark sentinels, wrapped in their eternal blanket of snow. "To think," Miriam said softly during a pause between songs, "that raffle seemed such a disaster at first. Yet, look how God has provided. Not just shelter, but a true home and good neighbors too." "Amen," Ruth agreed. "He works in mysterious ways, but always for good if we trust his guidance." Charles looked around at their faces, glowing in the lamplight. These 8 women had filled his lonely cabin with music, laughter, and faith. They had taught him that family could be found in the most unexpected places. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The singing resumed, carrying out into the quiet night. Inside the warm cabin, hope bloomed like spring flowers under snow, nurtured by trust freely given and honor faithfully kept. The winter garden flourished despite the mountain cold. Behind the cabin, the sisters had dug neat rows, filling them with hardy vegetables that could withstand frost. Turnips, carrots, and potatoes nestled deep in the dark soil, protected by thick layers of straw. Ruth had shown Charles how to build cold frames from old windows, creating tiny glass houses where kale and cabbage grew green and strong. Charles marveled at how the women had transformed his bare patch of earth. Where there had once been only scrub grass, life now grew in abundance. Even the wildflowers they'd planted along the fence bloomed bravely against the snow. One crisp morning, Charles returned from a successful elk hunt, the meat wrapped carefully in burlap and loaded on his pack horse. He could hear hammering before he even rounded the final bend. The sound made him smile. The sisters never seemed to rest. The small chapel was taking shape beside his cabin, its rough-hewn logs already rising chest-high. Lydia and Sarah worked together, notching the ends of a fresh timber while Hannah and Miriam mixed mud and straw for chinking. The other sisters formed a line, passing rocks from the creek to build a sturdy foundation. "Welcome home," Ruth called out, setting down her hammer. Her cheeks were flushed from work, her plain black bonnet dusted with sawdust. "We've made good progress today." Charles dismounted, leading his horses to the barn. "Looks fine indeed. Never thought I'd see a proper church on my land." "The Lord provides opportunities," Ruth said, falling into step beside him, just as he provided that bell. They both glanced at the brass bell that sat waiting to be mounted. It had arrived by wagon last week, a gift from the townspeople who had grown to appreciate the sisters' quiet service. The inscription read simply, "For the Mountain Chapel, with gratitude." Inside the barn, Charles began unloading his kill while Ruth helped brush down the horses. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared daily rhythms. "Marshall Thompson's boy is coming tomorrow for his reading lesson," Ruth mentioned as they finished. "And the Weber twins. Their mother says they're already spelling better." Charles nodded, pleased but shy about it. The steady stream of children visiting for lessons had become normal now, turning his once silent homestead into a place of learning and laughter. That afternoon, while the sisters continued work on the chapel, Charles dressed the elk meat and hung it to cure in the smokehouse they'd built together. The rich smell of applewood smoke drifted across the yard, mixing with the sound of hymns the women sang as they worked. Evening brought them all inside, where Esther's soup bubbled invitingly on the stove. They had just finished blessing the meal when hoofbeats approached. Charles opened the door to find Bobby Miller, the marshal's deputy, looking uncomfortable atop his horse. "Evening, Boone," the young man said, touching his hat to the sisters visible behind Charles. "Marshal asked me to deliver this." He held out an official-looking envelope. "You're summoned to court next Tuesday. Sorry to bring bad news at supper time." Charles took the paper, frowning. "What's this about?" "Something about land rights. That railroad lawyer, Jenkins, filed papers. Claims he's got a deed showing you sold your claim last spring." Bobby shifted in his saddle. "Marshal says it looks mighty suspicious, but you'll need to appear and sort it out proper." After the deputy rode away, Charles stood staring at the summons while the sisters gathered anxiously around him. His hands trembled slightly as he read the formal language. "It's a lie," he said finally, his voice rough. "I never sold an inch of this land. My father worked it 30 years before me." "We believe you," Ruth said firmly. The other sisters nodded. "But how can they make such a false claim?" Charles sank into his chair by the fire, the paper crumpling in his grip. "Jenkins and his railroad men. They tried to pressure me before you all came, offered to buy the land cheap. When I refused," he trailed off, remembering their veiled threats. "They must have forged the deed," Naomi said, her quiet voice angry, "thinking you wouldn't fight back with your reputation already questioned because of us." "We'll stand with you," Sarah declared. "We've seen your honest heart these months past. The judge must hear the truth." But Charles stared into the flames, his face haunted. Everything he'd built, everything they'd created together, it could all be lost to railroad greed and false papers. His father's legacy, the sisters' sanctuary, the children's school, all of it gone with one court ruling. The women exchanged worried looks as silence filled the cabin. The soup grew cold on the table, forgotten. Outside, snow began to fall, adding to the sense of gathering darkness. Ruth moved quietly to Charles's side. She placed her hand gently on his arm, the touch startling him from his bitter thoughts. "Charles," she said softly, using his given name for the first time, "God did not bring us here to shame you, but to strengthen you." He looked up, meeting her steady gaze. The firelight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, reminding him of starlight on mountain streams. 8 witnesses stand ready to speak for your character," she continued. "The townspeople who once doubted you now send their children to learn in your home. Even that bell was given in trust and gratitude." The other sisters gathered closer, their presence forming a circle of support around his chair. "And Henry Red Elk," Miriam added suddenly. "He knew your father, didn't he? Surely he can testify about your family's claim to this land." Charles straightened slightly. He hadn't thought of the old Ute scout in months, but Miriam was right. Henry had been his father's friend and hunting companion for decades. He knew every boundary and agreement concerning the Boone homestead. "We'll ride to town first thing tomorrow," Ruth said decisively. "We can ask Marshal Thompson to send word to Henry. There's time before Tuesday to gather what we need." Looking around at their determined faces, Charles felt shame at his moment of despair. These women had faced their own trials with unwavering faith. He owed them no less courage now. "You're right," he said, standing up slowly. "We'll fight this proper and legal. No running, no hiding." "That's the Charles we know," Hannah said warmly. "Now let's eat before this soup gets any colder. We'll need our strength." As they finally settled around the table, the familiar ritual of passing bowls and breaking bread together eased some of the tension. The sisters began discussing plans for tomorrow, their practical suggestions grounding Charles' worried thoughts. Later, after the dishes were cleared and most had gone to bed, Charles sat up by the dying fire. Ruth brought him a cup of tea, settling nearby with her mending. "I never thought to have so much to lose," he said quietly, watching the flames. "This land was just earth and trees before. Now it's..." "Home," Ruth finished when he faltered. For all of us. She set aside her sewing and looked at him steadily. Which is why we'll defend it together, with truth and faith to guide us. Charles nodded, too moved to speak. Outside, snow continued falling, blanketing the sleeping garden and the half-built chapel in pristine white. Inside, hope flickered like the firelight, small but enduring, warming those who gathered in its glow. Dawn brought no comfort as Charles saddled his horse. The snow fell thick and steady, coating his shoulders as he secured his saddlebags. Inside the cabin, the sisters gathered around him, their faces drawn with worry. The weather's turning fierce, Ruth said, handing him a bundle of fresh biscuits wrapped in cloth. Perhaps the hearing could be delayed? Charles shook his head. Court date's set, best face it straight on. He tucked the food away, avoiding their concerned looks. Keep the fires burning. I'll return by nightfall. The sisters watched from the doorway as he rode out, his dark form quickly swallowed by the swirling snow. Their prayers followed him down the mountain trail, carried on the bitter wind. The journey to Breckenridge took twice as long as usual. Snow plastered Charles's coat and collected in his horse's mane. By the time he reached town, the courthouse bell was already tolling 9 o'clock. He stomped snow from his boots in the entrance, his stomach knotting at the sight of so many townspeople already gathered. Word of the hearing had spread fast. Whispers followed him as he made his way to the front. Jenkins, the railroad lawyer, sat smugly at a table, his suit crisp despite the weather. Beside him lounged 2 men Charles didn't recognize, likely hired witnesses. The sight of their practiced ease made his hands clench. Judge Wilson entered, his black robes sweeping. The room fell silent as he took his seat, peering over his spectacles at the assembled crowd. Court is now in session, the clerk announced. The matter of Western Pacific Railroad versus Charles Boone, regarding deed and title to 160 acres in Summit County. Jenkins rose smoothly, producing a sheaf of papers. Your Honor, I present a properly executed deed of sale, signed by Mr. Boone this past March, conveying full rights to his homestead claim in exchange for fair compensation. Charles stood abruptly. That's a lie. I never sold an inch. Mr. Boone, the judge interrupted sharply. You'll have your turn to speak. Continue, Mr. Jenkins. The lawyer's smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached the bench. I have here the original deed complete with Mr. Boone's signature, witnessed by 2 upstanding citizens. He gestured to his companions. Mr. Thompson and Mr. Green will testify to seeing the document signed. Charles's heart pounded as the judge examined the paper. He knew his own signature, had never put it to any sale. But how could he prove it? The 2 witnesses took their turns, spinning careful tales about watching him sign away his land that spring day. Their stories matched too perfectly, rehearsed to convince. When Charles finally stood to speak, his voice shook with suppressed anger. Your Honor, these men are lying. I've never met them before today. That paper's a forgery. My father worked that land 30 years before passing it to me. I'd never sell it, least of all to men who tried forcing me out. Do you have proof of this alleged coercion? The judge asked. Charles faltered. The railroad men's threats had always been careful, spoken in private. No written proof, Your Honor. But ask Marshal Thompson. He knows they've been pressing me to sell. The marshal isn't here today, Jenkins cut in smoothly. Convenient timing, perhaps? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Charles realized too late that the marshal's absence was no accident. The railroad had planned everything carefully. And what of these women you're keeping? Jenkins pressed. 8 unmarried sisters living alone with you? Perhaps your judgment in other matters is equally questionable. Heat flooded Charles's face as disapproving whispers filled the room. He wanted to shout that the sisters were holy women, teachers of children, builders of chapel and community. But the words stuck in his throat. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. The deed appears properly executed, Mr. Boone. Without clear evidence of forgery, this court must respect the document as binding. He lifted his gavel. The railroad's claim is upheld. You and any dependents must vacate the property by winter's end. The gavel struck like thunder. Charles stood frozen as Jenkins and his witnesses shook hands, their victory complete. Around him, townspeople whispered that perhaps God was finally punishing the strange mountain man and his household of women. The ride home seemed endless. Snow fell heavier now, driven by bitter wind. Charles's mind spun with the magnitude of their loss. Not just his father's land, but the sisters' sanctuary, the children's school, their growing garden, all to be torn down for railroad tracks. Darkness had fallen by the time he reached the cabin. Light spilled from its windows, and smoke curled from the chimney despite the storm. For a moment, he sat his horse, heart aching at the sight of the home they'd built together. Inside, the sisters gathered around him, hope dying in their eyes as he delivered the grim news. Silence fell heavy as snow as they absorbed the court's decision. "But where will we go?" Sarah whispered, clutching her younger sister's hand. Before Charles could answer, harsh coughing broke the quiet. They turned to see Esther doubled over in her chair, her thin frame shaking with each racking breath. Ruth rushed to her side. "She's burning with fever," she called, touching Esther's forehead. "Hannah, fetch water. Miriam, the willow bark tea." The sisters sprang into action as Charles helped carry Esther to bed. Her skin felt like fire, her breathing labored and wet. Pneumonia, the curse that had plagued her since childhood, now returning in their darkest hour. Through the long night they tended her. The sisters took turns applying cool cloths and helping her sip broth, while Charles kept the fires blazing against the storm. Outside, wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows like angry spirits. Near midnight, Esther's fever spiked dangerously. Her breathing grew shallow, her words delirious. Charles paced the cabin, feeling more helpless than he had even in the courtroom. Finally, unable to bear it longer, he knelt beside her bed. The sisters drew back, watching as this quiet man who rarely spoke of faith clasped his hands and began to pray aloud. "Lord," he whispered hoarsely, "I ain't worthy to ask your help. I've failed these women you trusted to my care, failed my father's legacy, failed your purpose, whatever it might have been." His voice cracked. "But please, please don't punish Esther for my shortcomings. She's done nothing but good, teaching your word to children, showing kindness to all. Take the land if you must, but spare her life. Have mercy, Lord. Have mercy." Tears fell unnoticed down his weathered cheeks as he prayed. The sisters joined him, their soft voices rising in harmony with the storm's fury. Outside, the blizzard raged on, as if heaven itself reflected the tempest in Charles's soul. Hour after hour, they kept their vigil. Esther's breathing remained shallow, her fever unbroken. Charles stayed by her bedside until dawn, praying without cease, while the sisters worked to ease her suffering. Morning light found him still kneeling, empty of words but full of desperate hope. The storm matched his inner turmoil, wild, relentless, and showing no sign of relief. Days melted together as the blizzard raged without mercy. Inside the cabin, time measured itself in Esther's labored breaths and the endless rotation of hot compresses the sisters applied to her burning forehead. The wooden walls groaned against howling wind while snow piled ever higher outside. Ruth took charge of nursing duties, organizing her sisters into shifts. "Sarah, steep more willow bark tea. Naomi, we need fresh cloths. Lydia, keep that kettle full." Her quiet authority held them steady despite their fears. Charles barely slept. Each morning before dawn, he would bundle himself against the bitter cold and trudge out to split more firewood. The sharp crack of his axe punctuated the storm's roar as he worked tirelessly, determined to keep the cabin warm. His muscles ached, but he welcomed the pain. It was better than the helplessness he felt by Esther's bedside. Inside, the sisters worked with quiet efficiency. Hannah and Miriam took turns reading scripture aloud while they tended to Esther. Leah, the youngest, helped prepare chicken broth from their dwindling stores. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, herb tea, and worry. At night, Charles kept vigil in the corner chair, watching shadows dance on the rough-hewn walls as Esther tossed in fever dreams. Sometimes she would cry out in German, words he couldn't understand, but that made her sisters exchange concerned glances. Other times she lay so still that only the slight rise and fall of her chest showed she lived. On the third night of the storm, Sarah approached Charles as he sat by the fire. Her voice was hesitant. "Brother Charles, we've been talking among ourselves." She twisted her apron in her hands. "About a solution to our troubles." Charles looked up, noting how the other sisters had gathered nearby, all except Ruth, who stayed by Esther's bed. "What kind of solution?" If you were to marry one of us, Sarah began. No. Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I won't hear of it. Please listen, Miriam stepped forward. It would silence the gossip, give us legal protection. The railroad couldn't. Marriage ain't a business arrangement, Charles cut in, his voice rough with emotion, and it sure ain't something to be done out of fear. He looked at each sister in turn. Your people teach that marriage is sacred before God. So do mine. I won't mock that sanctity just to quiet wagging tongues. But Charles, Hannah pleaded, what will become of us when they force us from the land? He ran a hand through his hair, grief and determination warring in his expression. I don't know, but I do know that doing wrong to prevent wrong is still wrong. Marriage must come from love and choice, not desperate necessity. From the sickbed came sudden coughing. They rushed to Esther's side as she struggled to speak through chattering teeth. Her eyes were bright with fever as she grabbed Charles's sleeve. Listen, she whispered hoarsely. God didn't bring us here for shame to destroy his purpose. Her words came in gasps. Don't let fear, don't let their judgment tear apart what he has begun. The effort exhausted her and she fell back against the pillows. Ruth wiped her sister's brow while giving Charles a long look. She speaks truth even in fever. We didn't survive our journey west just to surrender our dignity. Now. Charles nodded slowly. Your faith shames me sometimes, Ruth. Here I am feeling sorry for myself while you all keep showing such courage. Faith is tested in fire, Ruth said softly, like gold being refined. Perhaps this trial is our refining time. Through the night, the storm raged on. Charles split his time between stoking the fires and helping tend to Esther. The sisters worked in quiet harmony, passing cups of tea and bowls of broth, changing compresses and murmuring prayers. Dawn brought no relief. Charles forced himself out into the freezing wind to chop more wood, his arms leaden with exhaustion. The snow was nearly to his waist now. Each log he split felt heavier than the last, but he couldn't stop. Their very survival depended on keeping the fires fed. Inside, Esther's condition worsened. Her breathing grew more labored, and her fever climbed higher. The sisters took turns holding her hands, singing hymns in their native German while tears froze on their cheeks. Charles felt the weight of their fear pressing down like the snow on the cabin roof. Lord, he prayed silently as he worked, I ain't asking for myself anymore, but these women trusted me to protect them. Show me how to keep that trust without compromising what's right. The days blurred together. Charles lost track of how many times he'd split wood, how many compresses they'd applied to Esther's forehead, how many prayers they'd whispered. The storm seemed endless. As if winter itself, he was trying to bury them alive. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. First, the wind's howl softened to a whisper. Then gaps appeared in the clouds, letting weak sunlight filter through. The snow finally stopped falling, leaving the world hushed and white. On the morning the storm broke, Charles stepped outside to find the cabin nearly buried in drifts. The sun rose clear and cold over a transformed landscape. Every tree branch bore a thick coating of snow, gleaming like crystal in the dawn light. The air was so sharp it hurt to breathe. He stood there a long moment, tears freezing on his cheeks. The cabin had weathered the storm. They all had. Battered but intact, just like their strange family. Inside, Ruth met him with a smile that made his heart skip. Her fever broke in the night, she said softly. She's sleeping naturally now. Charles hurried to Esther's bedside. Her breathing was easier, her face peaceful in true sleep for the first time in days. The other sisters gathered around, joy and relief evident in their tired faces. Thank you, Lord, Charles whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He looked at the women who had become his family. Ruth's quiet strength, Sarah's gentle determination, Hannah's unwavering faith, all of them supporting each other through the crisis. They had refused to let him give in to despair or compromise his principles. Esther stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. Though weak, her gaze was clear as she looked at Charles. You're still here, she murmured. He took her frail hand in his calloused one. Course I am, we all are. And we ain't going anywhere. Good, she whispered, managing a faint smile before drifting back to sleep. Charles straightened, new resolve filling him. The railroad might have the law on their side for now, but he would find a way to fight back. God hadn't brought these women into his life just to abandon them. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with dignity and faith intact. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the crystal-clear sky, making the snow-covered world sparkle like diamonds. The storm had passed, leaving them stronger for having weathered it. Charles stepped out onto the porch, breathing deeply of the pristine air. His tears froze on his cheeks, but they were no longer tears of despair. These were tears of determination, of gratitude, of fierce resolve to keep fighting for what was right. The cabin stood firm behind him, smoke rising straight and true from the chimney into the cold mountain air. Within its walls, his newfound family was safe for now. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them together, their faith tested, but unbroken. Charles sat hunched over the wagon reins, his breath frosting in the bitter morning air. The sisters huddled close behind him, wrapped in every blanket they owned. None had been willing to stay behind for this final hearing. "The Lord goes with us," Ruth said softly, touching his arm. The wagon wheels creaked over ice-rutted roads as they made their slow way down to Breckenridge. Charles's heart felt as heavy as the leaden sky above. He had prayed through the night for strength, but dread still gnawed at his stomach. The courthouse steps were crowded when they arrived. Townsfolk pressed close, whispering as Charles helped the sisters down from the wagon. Inside, the heat of too many bodies made the air thick. The railroad lawyer stood at the front, papers spread before him, a smirk playing at his lips. "The deed is clear," the lawyer announced, holding up the document. Mr. Boone signed over his rights. Charles started to protest, but movement at the back of the room caught his attention. An elderly Ute scout, bent with age but eyes still sharp, made his way forward through the crowd. "I speak truth today," the old man declared in careful English. "Many winters ago I witnessed agreement between Boone father and my people." He pointed a weathered finger at Charles. "This man's father makes sacred pact with tribe. Land rights given through proper ceremony. I was there, I saw—" The lawyer's smirk faltered. "That's hardly legal documentation." "Actually," the judge interrupted, "tribal testimony carries significant weight in territorial law." He studied the deed more closely. "And this signature shows signs of forgery." Sweat beaded on the preacher's forehead as attention turned his way. A envelope fell from his Bible, spilling railroad money across the floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Order!" The judge's gavel cracked like gunfire. "Given this evidence of corruption, I hereby overturn the eviction notice. The land remains with Charles Boone, its rightful owner." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Charles stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe, until Ruth's hand slipped into his. Her smile was bright with joyful tears. "Your father's honor protected us," she whispered, "just as you have." Charles could only nod, his throat too tight for words. God's providence had prevailed after all, through paths he never could have foreseen. The wagon rolled up to the cabin just as the sun broke through winter clouds. Cheers erupted from inside as Charles and the sisters stepped down. Esther, propped up with pillows in her chair by the fire, beamed as her sisters rushed to embrace Charles. "God has answered our prayers," she said, her voice thin but bright. Over the next few days, a steady stream of townsfolk made their way up the mountain path. They brought fresh-baked bread, preserved fruit, and heartfelt apologies. Charles accepted each offering with quiet grace, though his ears still burned red at the attention. "We were wrong to judge," Mrs. Henderson from the general store admitted, setting down a basket of eggs. "This place has become a blessing to us all." Word spread that Reverend Crane had left town in disgrace, unable to face his congregation after the exposure of his greed. The new reverend, a gentle-spoken man named Miller, rode up personally to pledge his support. "Your chapel here serves the Lord's work," he declared, watching children file in for their reading lessons. "We would be honored to partner in your ministry." The sisters threw themselves into their calling with renewed vigor. Sarah and Miriam taught numbers and letters, while Hannah tended to sick folk who came seeking help. The little chapel rang with hymns each Sunday, Charles's deep voice joining the sisters' sweet harmonies without hesitation now. One evening, after the dishes were cleared and the younger sisters had gone to bed, Ruth lingered by the hearth. Charles sat in his usual spot, whittling a toy horse for one of their young students. "I have been thinking," Ruth said softly, her hands folded in her lap. About staying here. Not because I must, but because… She paused, color rising in her cheeks. Because my heart has found its home. Charles's knife stilled. He looked up, hope and fear warring in his expression. You mean… I love you, Charles Boone, she whispered. Your kindness, your strength, your faith. I choose to remain here, if you'll have me. Charles set aside his whittling with trembling hands. Standing, he reached for Ruth's fingers, marveling at how perfectly they fit within his own. Shall we step outside? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Together they walked into the crisp night air. Fresh snow glittered beneath the full moon, the world around them sparkling like diamonds. Ruth's hand stayed warm in his, a promise of belonging neither had dared to dream possible. Spring burst upon the mountains like a revelation. Melting snow fed crystal streams that tumbled down rocky slopes, their song a constant melody around the cabin. Purple columbines and golden banner flowers dotted the meadows, while tender green shoots pushed through dark soil in the sisters' newly tilled gardens. Charles stood at the garden fence watching Ruth and Hannah plant rows of potatoes and carrots. The sight of new life emerging filled him with quiet joy. Near the chapel, Sarah and Miriam taught 3 young children their letters, their voices carrying on the warm breeze. One by one, several sisters found love with local ranchers. Charles escorted each bride down the chapel aisle, his chest swelling with pride. First came Naomi, marrying Tom Henderson, whose mother had been among the first to welcome them. Then, Lydia wed James Miller, the new reverend's son. Each wedding brought more visitors, more connections, more proof that their mountain sanctuary had grown into something wonderful. The chapel bell rang out regularly now, for baptisms of newborns, for wedding celebrations, and every Sunday when families gathered from miles around. Children played in the meadow while parents worshipped, their laughter mixing with hymns. Who would have thought, old Marshall Peters remarked one Sunday, that the man they called the Virgin Mountain Man would become such a pillar of the community? Charles ducked his head but smiled. The old shame had melted like spring snow, replaced by quiet confidence in who he was, a man of honor, trusted and respected. That evening at supper, Ruth spread out rough sketches on the table. I thought perhaps we might build here, she said, pointing to a spot near the chapel. A larger home, with room for children. Charles's face flushed red as summer roses. The remaining sisters burst into delighted laughter. Look at him blush, Leah teased, though he's not nearly so shy as he once was. Much obliged for your notice, Charles replied with a grin, surprising them all. As twilight painted the sky in purple and gold, voices lifted in song from the chapel. Charles stood in the doorway of his cabin. No, their cabin, listening to the harmony float across the valley. He remembered that first night, sleeping alone on the hearth, never dreaming his solitary refuge would become the heart of such a family. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the mountain valley as Charles and Ruth stood hand in hand outside the chapel. The bell's clear tone rang out across the meadow, calling their scattered family home. 6 months had passed since their wedding day, and the transformation of their mountain community still filled Charles with wonder. Children darted through the tall grass, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Little Mary Henderson, Naomi's daughter, chased her cousins with wild abandon. Near the creek, women hung clean sheets that snapped like sails in the wind. Along the split-rail fence, James Miller and Tom Henderson worked side by side, replacing worn posts while sharing news of cattle prices. Who would have thought, Ruth whispered, squeezing Charles's hand, that a raffle ticket would lead to all this? Charles gazed at the scene before him. What had once brought whispers of scandal now stood as testament to God's providence. The sisters began gathering near the chapel steps, drawn by memories and love. Though they lived in different cabins now scattered across the valley, their bonds remained unbreakable. Sarah raised her voice first, the familiar notes of amazing grace floating on the evening air. One by one, the other sisters joined in, their harmony as pure as it had been that first night in Charles's cabin. Ruth's clear soprano soared above the rest while Charles added his deep baritone, no longer shy about singing. Thank you, Lord, Charles whispered, his voice thick with emotion, for turning my loneliness into such abundance. Later that evening, lamplight spilled from the cabin windows, casting warm rectangles on the ground outside. Around the supper table, faces glowed with joy as Charles bowed his head to pray. The scent of fresh bread and beef stew filled the air, while quiet laughter rippled between bowed heads. Charles opened his eyes, taking in the scene. Ruth beside him, sisters and their families gathered close, children fidgeting in their seats. Once he had feared the weight of scandal would crush him. Now, he saw only the blessing of family. The cabin stood steady against the gathering dark, smoke curling from its chimney into the star-filled sky. Like a beacon of hope it glowed, high in the Colorado mountains, offering warmth and welcome to all who passed by. A testament to the power of faith, forgiveness, and love. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.